Hello, class. I'm back with you again to talk about some more regulations. This time we're going to talk about Part 91 and how to get your certificate taken from you, right? Or how not to, rather. Okay. So I'm cracking open a soda here and we're going to get to it. I apologize in advance if you hear one of my cats in the background. He's a little forlorn, shall we say. After we took him to the vet yesterday, and he's missing a couple of things that he had before, if you know what I mean. So um, I commiserate with him, but if you hear him kind of meowing, that's why he's sad. All right, so let's get into this. So the first slide I showed you in class, right, had to do with this dude who decided to crash his own airplane on purpose for views. There's nothing wrong with his airplane or anything like that, but obviously just jumping out of your airplane and letting it crash in an area where there could be houses or people or property or any of that is reckless behavior. So the FAA and the NTSB investigated the crash and they figured all these things out. And as punitive action, they went ahead and took away his certificate. So he is no longer a pilot for one of the stupidest reasons I could think of. Right, so you might have heard about this when this happened, but I could never. Right, you work hard for your flight training, you pay a lot of money for it, and this guy just throws it all away. So don't be like him. Right, when we follow the regulations and do what we're supposed to do, and don't do what we're not supposed to do, we more times than not walk away with our certificate at the end of the day. Part of understanding what it means to be PIC is not only understanding the things that we need to do and the decisions that we need to make and the things that we're responsible for, but honestly, probably in reference to this particular situation, probably maturity is the word that I would use. So being PIC just means growing up and taking care of those responsibilities that you're supposed to take care of. So it's not just about the legal definitions or anything like that. It's not about who logs the PIC time. It's not really about any of that. It's just about acting as PIC, right? What does it mean to step up to that? When you go to the airlines, if that's what you want to do, or do corporate aviation, you will start as a first officer. Right? And a first officer in a 121 or 135 operation can only log second in command time. That means they are not the final authority of that particular flight. However, it is a great honor and responsibility and a really big deal once you move from that right seat to the left seat and become captain. You need a certain amount of time as second in command, certain amount of experience. You have to prove to your company that you're capable of making that jump, that you're capable of basically keeping 100 or 200 or 300 or however many passengers there are safe, right? By making safe decisions and handling emergency situations if that should happen in a safe manner. So being PIC is a really, really big deal, okay? So I want you guys to just be thinking that, right? The entire time you're going through your flight training, think about uh, doing PIC things, thinking PIC thoughts, and making PIC decisions. Okay, live, breathe, PIC. So as flight instructors, our job is to help you get into that kind of thought process. So we ask a lot of questions, kind of sarcastic in nature to kind of help you get to that point. So once we've taught you maneuvers or procedures or whatever we're teaching you, right, we always look to make sure that you understand the procedure enough to the point where you can confidently do what you need to do. Right, so sometimes when you guys are going through stuff and have questions, if it's not a matter of safety, sometimes we'll answer them. Sometimes we will shrug our shoulders, right? And if you don't sound confident about the procedure, we're going to say something like this, right? Are you asking me or are you telling me? Right? I have students that they're saying a sentence, right? They're relaying to me some information, but their voice kind of goes up at the end as it would if they were asking a question. So it doesn't sound that confident. So I love to say that. Are you asking me or are you telling me? Another thing is if they have a question, and again, if it's not a matter of safety or anything, um, then I usually say, I don't know. You're PIC, right? You figure it out. You should know. Okay. And then The last one here is if they turn and they ask for help in a safe situation. I like to just say, I don't know, I'm a passenger. I don't know anything, right? So you're going to have instances where you will be in that position, right? You'll be flying with somebody maybe who has no idea about aviation, and can't really help you do those tasks or guide you at all. So you have to be PIC and have to think PIC thoughts and make PIC decisions and do PIC things, right? Sometimes you're the only person who is qualified to do that on board. So before we can send you solo, we really have to make sure that you're able to do that, right? So Part 91 is a kind of a comprehensive guide on how to do that. It talks about like the legal aspect of being PIC, but it also talks about a lot more outside of that. And this is all knowledge that you need to have in your head, right, to apply to situations you might face on a day-to-day basis. So again, this is preparation for solo, right? And then, of course, the end goal that's not really an end goal, right, is for you to become a private pilot. So, no one can do things except for you on the check ride. The examiner's just there to watch and see that you're able to be PIC. So that is the important thing right there. Nudge. Stop scratching. Sorry, my cat is scratching our chair in the office. Okay. But not only will you not earn a certificate or a rating if you're not able to demonstrate that you're able to be PIC, there can be some larger ramifications that stem from that. You can get your certificate taken away if you have one, just like our guy who decided to just like YOLO out of his airplane. You might have to clean up aircraft seats, right? If you scare your passengers, if you scare living daylights out of them, it could cost you some money or even your life, right? So be sure that you are able to do those things, okay? The way I've structured Part 91 is a series of questions that pertains to the pilot, aircraft, environment, and there's not really anything for external pressures. But I've essentially crafted the applicable regulations and arranged them so that they kind of match with some of the PAVE acronym. And the reason why I'm doing that is because A, I don't want it to be boring. I don't want it to be like a list of regulations, right? That's no fun. But I also want it to be structured in a way that gets you thinking about these things you have to consider when you're PIC, right? So question number one, can you legally be PIC? Like, do you meet all the standards? Are you certificated and rated properly enough to be PIC? Are you feeling physically fit enough in that moment, right, to be PIC? What about information, right? When we are the final authority of the aircraft, you bet there's a lot of stuff that we have to know, right? And it's not just like systems or aerodynamics or any of that. It's that moment-to-moment information. So we're the ones responsible for getting a weather briefing and things of that nature. Backup plans, right? As a PIC, always have a plan B. Think about when we do a takeoff briefing. We expect that the aircraft is going to climb out no problem. We're going to get to altitude. We're going to do what we need to do and then head back to the airport, right? We think that all of that is going to happen. However, every time we do that pre-takeoff briefing, right? If we're on the runway or just above and we have engine failure, we're pulling that throttle back to idle, right? Make sure idle cut off, settling down on the runway, getting those brakes in there, trying to get off the runway if we can safely, right? If we have less than 1,000 feet, then we will land straight ahead, right, within 30 degrees of the nose, and we're going to put it down in an open spot there. And then if we're above 1,000 feet AGL, right, we're going to try to turn around and come back and land. So there, we've crafted ourselves a plan B for pretty much every stage of that climb out. And that's just part of being a pilot, is thinking about those what ifs. We don't want to think about those, but we have to. So hopefully that becomes part of your thinking. And then aside from just being legally able to be PIC, are you able to be PIC in a certain environment? So that kind of refers to the VFR weathermen's, right? So is the weather good enough for me to be PIC in this environment? Okay. So when we ask these questions, 91 usually offers us answers. Legally being PIC is more of a 61 thing, so that's why I don't have a 91 regulation in there, but it's still a good question to ask, right? So make sure that you've got the appropriate certificates and ratings for that particular operation. Remember, if you've got a private pilot certificate and an airplane single engine land rating, you cannot be PIC on a aircraft that is airplane multi-engine land. That's just the nature of ratings and certificates. Ratings give you a certain set of privileges that does not extend to every single aircraft, so you'd need another rating for that. Recency of experience, so make sure that you're getting that flight review done in the preceding 24 calendar months. Remember, this can be taken, or what am I trying to say? A check ride that gives you either a certificate or an additional rating can take the place of that. So make sure you've got that down, and then also the 90-day currency, right? So 3 takeoffs and landings in the preceding 90 days. Think about the rules and limitations on that when we think about day and night, right? So this is a conversation you should sit down and have with yourself before you go out flying. Am I current? When's the last flight review I've had? Do I have the right certificates and ratings? Next, are you in a good enough physical state to be PIC? So are you feeling well enough? And you might also be thinking about the I'm safe checklist in reference to this. That's a really great thing to run on yourself, and alcohol is something that falls within that we're always checking on, right? But this is the official regulation that speaks on alcohol and drugs too, right? Drugs, I mean, should just be a giant no across the board. But alcohol, if you are at a legal age to consume it, there are limits to how you can do that. So you've got an 8-hour time frame before your flight where you have to stop consuming alcohol, right? And the phrase we use with this is 8 hours bottle to throttle. So make sure that you haven't had any alcohol in the 8 hours preceding your flight. You can't be under the influence of alcohol. So even if you, let's say, didn't have any alcohol in those 8 hours before your flight, but you felt like you were hungover, that would count as being under the influence, or you had like a headache that stemmed from drinking that wasn't quite at hangover level, that would count. And then a blood alcohol concentration of 0.04 or greater is just not okay. So it was brought up in class today, right, that these I guess parameters seem to contradict one another, but they really work in tandem so that there's no way around these rules, right? 8 hours doesn't seem like a lot of time, but if somebody goes really hard and has a night where they're slamming back 4, 5, or 6, beers or whatever, they're going to have a hard time getting that blood alcohol concentration down to less than 0.04, and probably a hard time not having a hangover, right? So all of these are just in place to kind of keep people from bending the rules, because it would be very easy, right? To, I don't know, have a beer at midnight and show up for your 7 a.m. flight and feel completely fine, right? But you're still within that 8-hour time frame. So these are just additional parameters to kind of keep us safe. At the end, we kind of talk about the difference between the legal minimums of the law and then our own personal minimums, which kind of brings us a little bit more comfort and safety. So that's kind of how you can think about these 3 things of this regulation, is that all these things exist to basically make sure that we have that buffer or barrier to make sure that we're not showing up with alcohol in our system, right? Because it's just not good for you or anybody else. And also think about the hypoxia we talked about. This is an example of histotoxic hypoxia. If you climb to an altitude where there is less oxygen, not only are you experiencing histotoxic hypoxia, but you're also subjecting yourself to hypoxic hypoxia. And then on top of that, let's say you get a bird strike at a high altitude. Well, now, if you get cut from that windshield or anything like that, you are now losing blood, right? So that's like 3 types of hypoxia happening at the same time. Or carbon monoxide poisoning is another example of hypemic. So you're just lowering the stakes for yourself by following the regulation. The next thing is a really, really big thing. This is the regulation that the FAA catches most people on. So 91103 is the regulation I like to just call the know-it-all, know everything regulation. Shout out to Kenny Bro, our old chief flight instructor. He taught me this class that I'm teaching you now, and that was his phrase for that, right? Know everything. So depending on the parameters of your flight, you should make yourself comfortable with all available information concerning that flight. In the regulation, there are specific requirements for different types of flight, right? So if you are leaving the vicinity of an airport, and I believe that's going beyond 15 miles away from the airport, I think that's what vicinity is by definition. It could be 25, something in that range, right? You need an official weather report or briefing, right? Forecast is part of that. Fuel requirements, so make sure you have enough alternatives available, right? Traffic delays communicated by ATC. So you need to basically make yourself aware of all those things. But remember, if we're talking about legal bare minimums compared to personal minimums, which are, again, more comfortable and safe for us, then we will go above and beyond this. And just because there's something not specifically listed in this regulation, that does not mean that the FAA is going to just like blow past that. So if there's something that should have been done that's not listed here, they could still very well use that against you. Okay. And then any flight, right? You should know the runway lengths at your airports that you're, intending to go to, and then takeoff and landing distances. So have a rough idea of that. And when we get to the performance section of the class, we'll talk about how to calculate those. But the cool thing is calculating them doesn't have to be particularly difficult. You can do something called erring on the side of caution. So it's like an estimation um, in the direction of safety. So if you've got like a performance chart or anything like that, you can basically round up your numbers to make sure you have enough length for takeoff and landing. Right? We should be fine here because we're a small single engine aircraft. But especially when we're going other places, we definitely want to make sure that we have enough. Okay, so don't get caught slipping on this regulation. Make sure that you do all the planning that you need to do to make sure that you are aware of everything. Okay. One of the senior faculty at the school was going out on a cross country, an instrument cross country for that matter, and they were supposed to land, I believe, out at like Harrisburg or do touch and go or something out there. And they checked the NOTAMs before they left, which again are the notices to air missions. So they're just like notifications about runway closures, taxiway closures, just things of that nature. And before they left, they didn't see anything that was a problem or a conflict. But when they were on approach to Harrisburg, they broke out of the clouds, and there is this yellow X that was all lit up on the runway, and there are workers on the runway um, fixing it. And what had happened was a NOTAM was released after they had already taken off and left. So Center should have told them about that, right? But they didn't. There's no way they really could have known about that because they already left. But they made the best decision and they went around and they just continued back to Carbondale here. But the point I'm making there is if you're not aware of what's happening, you're in a bigger hole, right? Because even when you look at all of your available resources and materials, there's nothing that says that there's something that won't change, right? We know how fickle the weather is. There are some days that you're sitting in my class, it might look like you're going to fly, and then by the end of the class, you're walking out and you're like, these clouds are kind of low. So things change over time, and we have to try our best to keep up with those changes. Can we keep up with everything? No, but we have to try our best as PIC. If we recall our dear friend who decided to bail out of his airplane and crash it for views and things like that, 9113 is the regulation that got his certificate taken away. Right? That would be perceived in the eyes of most people, except for maybe him, or maybe him at the end of the day, because that headline said that he pled guilty, because maybe he realized there's no way out of it. But anyway, most of us at the end of the day would call what he did careless or reckless. So that's what 9113 talks about. You can't operate your aircraft in a manner that endangers the life or property of others. So I believe when his plane hit the ground, it landed, I think, on a house out there, or maybe on the property, something like that. But I would say even if it didn't do that, he still operated his aircraft in a way that could have potentially been harmful for a person. What if somebody was out there hiking in those mountains and they just look up and they get clobbered with an airplane, right? That's not good. So be really careful in your actions and the things you do, because sometimes we can't always, again, see everything, right? Um, we're human beings. We are very limited in the sense that we can only be in one place at one time and kind of experience one thing at a time. So we can't know where every single human is in the world or any of that, right? And plan um, plan that, right? So we just have to be careful in our operations, make sure we're doing things as safely as we know how to do them, for the benefit of ourselves and others. 9115 talks about dropping objects. So you can drop objects just so long as you take the necessary precautions to make sure that no people or property is like hurt or damaged. So I know flight team, they drop these, I think, blocks of wood and they try to make it in a trash can or something of the sort. They make sure that nobody's out there in that general area so they don't get hit with the block, right? Um, I would just maybe not drop things from an airplane, especially now when you're training. Think about it in terms of like professionalism, right? You're basically operating on behalf of the university. So anytime you go out on a cross country or practice area or things like that, the airplane says SIU, and we go to SIU, right? So we want to represent the university as best we can. And if that means not dropping objects, then we shouldn't do that, right? We shouldn't try to do any crazy stunts or anything like that. We should always operate with safety in mind. And then 111 is about operation near other aircraft. So you want to make sure that you talk to the people you're going to be formation flying with. We don't do that here at SIU, but if you were going out in your own personal airplane or you rented one from Flightline or whatever and you were allowed to do that, make sure that you talk to the PICs of the other airplanes so that you guys are coordinated in what you're going to do. Because you can obviously imagine what might go wrong if you're operating that close together and you guys haven't talked about all of the fine details and fine planning, right? You might crash into one another, and mid-air collisions never end well, okay? And then the last point is kind of extraneous for you guys. You can't make money anyway, but just know that you can't charge people for flights in formation flight. Can't make any money off that. And then 91-111, I talked about in class how we all go to Evansville at some point in our aviation training careers, at least here at SIU. So most nights you go to Evansville, there's going to be a line of like probably 5 to 7 people going in that same direction. So you just have to make sure that you are all spaced out appropriately. Because we're all moving in the same direction, we generally all choose the same altitude. So that kind of increases or decreases the spacing and distance from one another. We don't have that vertical aspect anymore. So when you're on that cross country, you just have to kind of be careful and mindful of how close you are to other people. Sometimes it's hard to match up speeds and everything to make sure you're not getting too close to them. Um, Oshkosh is another good example of that. So we fly into that pretty much every year. We have a tent and everything. I went this last year and I actually did the flying in, and man, is that crazy. They've got the way it's set up is they have a few different VFR checkpoints. So they're basically like towns or lakes or things like that, things you can really see from the air. And what happens is that traffic from that overall direction kind of converges over that particular point, and you really have to be watching because I mean there is so much traffic, and that line, man, it stretches out. But you're really close to people, you're following people, and they want you to be fairly close together so that the spacing of traffic is pretty efficient, I guess, so they can get everybody in fairly quickly. So when you're following somebody, and they wanted us all to do, I believe, 90 knots, so we had to just kind of eyeball that, try to keep that together as best as possible. It was a warm day, so it was bumpy. We were playing with power. We were trying to maintain the altitude they wanted us to maintain. But yeah, we were close together. I think they wanted us maybe a mile apart. I'd have to look at the procedure again. If you watch this and you want to know more about this, ask me about it in class because I've still got the procedure on my iPad that they released for that. But it was a crazy experience. So just be careful when you're close to other people in the air. We try to do that in the practice area. We've recently expanded the practice area to make sure we're not too close to people, but always be aware of your surroundings, right? Be listening to those radio calls, okay? I always have active listening going on when I'm out there in that practice area and on the way back, so I can just kind of get an overall picture where people are so I don't go in those same areas, okay? So be aware. All right, so going along with that, we have to consider the right-of-way rules, right? So right-of-way just says who has the precedence, right? Who's more important in that scenario, basically. So when we think about it from a like a car driving perspective, the way we learned about it in driver's ed was basically whoever goes first, right? Or whoever is supposed to go first. So for instance, if you stop at a stop sign and somebody reaches the stop sign a little bit before you, right, then they have the right of way and you have to wait for them. Do people always respect this? No, not really. And sadly, the same thing kind of happens in the air sometimes. People don't always follow the regulations like they should. But this is the layout, right? So it is up to us to see other aircraft and avoid other aircraft. The only legal scenario where we don't have to worry about that is when we're in less than VMC conditions, right? At that point, it is on center to try to keep us separated because we can't really see and avoid anymore. Okay, so if there's an aircraft in distress, so there's an emergency aircraft, let's say you are in, I don't know, pattern for 36 left, and there's I don't know, an aircraft that comes over the frequency that's inbound from the west, and they are telling tower that they're losing power, right? Their RPMs are starting to drop, now they've got no engine. Well, if you are ahead of them on, let's say, midfield downwind, the respectable thing to do, to just go ahead and do rather than have tower tell you, is to just keep extending out, right? Let them come on in and land because they've got an emergency situation. They might need runway 6, right? If that's as far as their engine will get them, or they might come in at 365. They might do a whole host of things, but the general practice when somebody has an emergency situation like that is to get all other aircraft that are fine out of the way and let them do what they need to do. So aircraft in distress always has the right of way. And some people will kind of use this for their benefit. If they so people when they've been in what we call a holding pattern for a while, so it's just like a circular, like a racetrack kind of shape that they keep making over the same spot in the sky. If they don't want to keep doing that, and there's no real emergency, some people will say minimum fuel to ATC, and that likely cuts down their hold time. So again, people don't really respect these regulations as much as they should, but that's the gist of that, right? Anybody who's having problems like that has the right of way. Number two, converging aircraft, right? So if aircraft are coming together, right, if they're meeting together, then the aircraft on the right side has the right of way. So I don't think I talked about this one in class. I just kind of like glanced over it. But let's say you are coming from the south, so you're on a heading of like 360, and there's an aircraft flying towards you off your right side, right? So they're coming from the east going westbound. They have the right of way, right? So it is up to you to move out of their way, right? They're fine to keep going the way they're going. And the reason why they had to create a rule like this is if both aircraft see each other and then they're both trying to move out of the way, they could end up colliding. So if we make it so that one aircraft maintains its course and the other one moves around that one, then we have a better chance of not having that midair collision happen. Now, the danger with this is what if somebody forgot what they were supposed to do, like who was supposed to move, and they didn't move out of the way, then that could be really dangerous. And then that might turn into a situation where that aircraft that is supposed to have the right of way might like just end up having to move themselves out of the way. So again, I would say remember these rules, right? Remember what you're supposed to do in these scenarios, but don't always assume that people are going to follow this regulation. Sometimes people don't care about this regulation, and sometimes people forget. So don't assume that people are going to do that. Next is approaching head on. It's pretty much the same thing, except this time both aircraft are moving to the right, and that basically just takes them out of harm's way of each other. Okay, so if you see an aircraft out your windshield and it looks like it's moving towards you, getting larger in size, then you need to alter your course to the right and hope and pray that they do the same thing, right? Hope that they don't forget. Okay, and then overtaking. So going back to that Evansville cross country, if you've got an airplane in you that or airplane in front of you that's a little slower, the best thing to do if you're going to maintain your faster airspeed is to change your course to the right and give them a decent amount of space, right, to make sure that you're not too close to them, but pass them on the right side because they're slower and they have the right of way, right? So do what you need to do on that. And then landing, whoever's lower has the right of way. So if you're on final approach and there's an aircraft that's lower than you, um, out in front of you, then they've got the right of way. If there's an aircraft that's lower than you behind you, they technically have the right of way. Do people misuse and abuse this particular part of this regulation a lot? Yes. There are people who at an uncontrolled airport will join final at a lower altitude than an airplane that's already on final to basically cut them off and take the right of way from them. So this is not to say that that's okay, right? That's not what the regulation says. It just says whoever is lower has the right of way on final approach. So don't be that person who cuts people off, because that's how accidents happen, especially when you've got different types of airplanes, right, that have different blind spots. So if you've got a high wing aircraft like a Cessna 172 cutting you off, and then and they're under you trying to get that right of way, then and you're a low wing aircraft like our Piper Arrows, you might not be able to see them until it's too late. So be careful. Don't be that person. Okay. A lot of times, uncontrolled airports are a crazy, crazy zoo. So make sure that you've got your head on a swivel, right? Don't ever expect people to do what they're supposed to do. In fact, I would say expect people to not do what they're supposed to do. Okay. It's like driving, right? Sometimes you have to drive for other people. You're not in their car, but you have to be cautious of them and basically be thinking about what they're going to do next because they can't drive, right? So same thing for flying. Be careful. And then the last little bit of this is making sure that we're high enough in the sky, right? We don't want to be too close to the ground because when there are people and cars and towns and things like that close to the ground and we're close to the ground, that can be scary, right? Back in the day, that was actually a legal thing before regulations really took off. There are these pilots called barnstormers, and they would basically fly from town to town, and their way to get the townsfolk's attention was actually to like do low passes over the town and everything. So, given the fact that this is happening just after the First World War, I don't know how many people took kindly to that. I would say for the most part, it kind of interested people. They left their duties and things to go see what was happening and everything. But if you've got some veterans and things like that from the First World War who don't really have a positive idea or association of aircraft that are doing low passes, you can see how that would be problematic. So eventually they made regulations that said that people had to maintain certain altitudes. So that's where 91-119 comes from. So just in general, you should always fly at an altitude that gives you the ability to land somewhere without an engine, without harming persons or property. So remember, sometimes that's avoidable. So like on the way back to the airport, if we're flying over Murfreesboro at 1400 MSL because we're planning for the traffic pattern, that's perfectly acceptable, right? That is a good exception. But in general, we should fly high enough where we're not going to crash into buildings or things like that. We should be high enough so that we can glide to a field or something that's, an area that's safe to land in. If you are over a town or a city, sometimes it's just like that. You're on a cross country over your town. You're going out to a practice area. You go over a town. You need to maintain this like fictional bubble, I guess. So you need to keep yourself 1,000 feet above the um, highest obstacle of that town or settlement or whatever you want to call it. And then from there, 2,000 feet around it, so a 2,000 foot radius from that, is an area that you should avoid. So 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle, and then 2,000 feet out from that. You basically create this imaginary cylinder that kind of looks like, I don't know, like a class Delta Aerospace would, right? And that's the area you're supposed to avoid. When you're doing things like ground reference maneuvers or even some of the maneuvers like stalls, right? If you're doing them close to that 1500 AGL minimum altitude, which is still legal and safe, make sure you're far enough away from those towns because if they've got some higher obstacles, right, then you could be permeating that imaginary block of airspace without knowing it. So make sure you've got that together. And then the most important is minimum safe altitude. So if you're not over a place that is congested, you can go a little bit lower, but this time it's just 500 feet above the surface, right? So 500 AGL or around these parts, that's like 800, 900 MSL, depending on where you're at. Make sure you do not go below that. Going below that, you break this reg directly, and that will be the end of your check ride if you're on one. So make sure that you recover before then. I will say a lot of students expect us as check airmen to tell them when they're supposed to go around. So if we pull your engine on a check ride and we give you a simulated engine failure, most students kind of wait for the examiner to say, okay, go ahead and recover. We're not going to say that, right? Because we are testing not only the appropriate skills, right, for that particular certificate or rating, but we are also testing your ability to be PIC and make those PIC decisions. So you should be able to figure out when it's time to recover, right? Add that engine power, start that climb out again. But don't wait for us to tell you when it's time to do that. Okay, you need to do that. And then scud running I talked about in class. I had a couple students of mine. The first year I taught, I sent them on a cross country, and the ceilings were a little bit on the low side. I want to say they're 5,000, 6,000, something like that. They both felt comfortable doing the cross country, but I told them if the ceilings drop, you need to turn around and come back, right? But both of them ended up scud running. So I think they chose an altitude of 3,500 and or maybe it was 4,500 or something like that. And they both, I was watching them on FlightAware, and they both started to dip below those altitudes, right? And they ended up spending some time up at Belleville until the weather got better, right? But make good decisions about your altitude. Don't play with altitude because it's a beautiful thing to have, right? Think about the fact that we climb out at the published VY airspeed. The whole reasoning for that is we want the most amount of altitude in the least amount of time. So the more altitude we have, the faster, the better, right? The more security we have, the more gliding distance we have in case we have a failure. So we want to always capitalize on that. We don't want to abuse that, do these low passes and dangerous things that we don't have to do, okay? Altitude is beautiful. Altitude is time. Altitude is distance. And then speaking of that scenario, right, we have to make sure that we've got at least one contingency plan, probably better to have 2, 3, 4 contingency plans um, as a pilot, right? So 91.3 talks about your responsibility and authority as PIC. So as I've said this whole time, right, you are responsible for and you are the final authority who determines what happens to that aircraft. So you're the one who has to decide to operate in a safe manner, okay? It is on you. If you have an emergency situation and you need to do something to rectify that situation, or maybe try to change the situation, and you figure out that it's either a question of safety or following the regulations, always pick the safety over the regulations. If you have to, I don't know, let's say, so going back to the regulation we talked about before about the minimum safe altitudes, let's say that you're out flying over an area that's mostly forests, right? There's a town up ahead, like, I don't know, a couple miles up ahead. You have an engine failure. You glide yourself, right? You pitch for your glide speed and you continue and you land that airplane on a road in the town. Did you break the regulation for the minimum safe altitude for the town? You betcha, right? You're definitely below that 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle, right? But because there were only forests out there, and hopefully you're not like just doing maneuvers over that area. Hopefully this is like a cross country and you're transitioning over that area. But because there were trees and everything, you made the logical decision, the safe decision, to land in the town on a road rather than in those trees. So sometimes it's okay to break regulations when that's the difference between being safe and unsafe. That is not to say that it's okay to just break them anytime you want to, right? Um, Following the regulations for the most part assures your safety, actually. If you go outside those regulations, you have a higher chance of getting yourself hurt or even worse, killed. Okay, and then it just says if you break a rule or you have to not follow a rule, then if the FAA wants a written report, then they will request that and you need to send that in. 91.7 talks about airworthiness, right? So you have to determine that the aircraft is airworthy, but you can also, or you also need to determine whether the flight is worth continuing or discontinuing when you have some sort of issue that causes the airplane to be unairworthy mid-flight. So, for instance, if you're losing out on, let's say, your electrical system, so your alternator stops working, stops creating that power, so now your battery is draining away. Sometimes the question is if you're like on a cross country, right? Do I continue to the destination or do I just turn around and go back to where I came from? So, figuring out what the best plan of action is up to the PIC. Would every single PIC respond the same way to the same problem? Probably not, right? You might have some variation over what some people consider safe, what others consider safe, right? So there might be differences there, but it is in your hands as PIC. This just says that you should follow ATC clearances and instructions. Again, if ATC tells you something that you feel is unsafe or contradicts the information that you have that you're pretty sure of, then you can deviate from that instruction, right? You have to tell them that you're going to do that, right? So if they want you to do something, I would say negative, like I can't do that, right? And then maybe if you have time, explain why. Or if you don't have time, don't worry about it, right? Your safety is so much more important. So fly that airplane first, and then they can yell at you on the ground all they want, right? But I would rather somebody be alive and be able to be yelled at than that controller, just feel really bad for the situation because something bad happened. So, a situation where this happens sometimes is when you have new controllers that join a facility and they're not quite sure of what the standard procedure is in that area. So they might have a specific way of asking for things or doing things at the previous facility that they worked at, and they might try to carry those things forward in their new job and new position. And sometimes that can be problematic and conflicting. Or sometimes maybe they're not aware of all the niche things that are associated with that particular airport. They might not know how to look for traffic, or that sometimes there are obstacles that hide the traffic from them. They might not know that there are popular reporting points like the Red Water Tower. They might have people try to do other things, or they might not see traffic and tell you to do something. So again, if you just feel that something is unsafe, or for sure it's unsafe, do not do it. Okay. Sometimes people just hit 360 clearing turns, 360-degree clearing turns to create spacing because there's an aircraft that is too close to them, and they don't take time to really, ask ATC if they can do that. Sometimes they just do it because they have to for safety. So make sure you have a valid reason, but do what you need to do to be safe. So those are all of the kind of the pilot-oriented questions or the PIC questions, if I want to be more specific, that you should have some sort of positive answer to. Have those contingency plans, understand what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do for the safety of yourself and others. Okay, and then once you've answered those questions or thought about those things and follow those regulations, then we can move on to things like the aircraft and the environment. So, as PIC, it's your job to determine airworthiness, and we've talked about the inspection, we've talked about the documents and those sorts of things, but that's not really all that determining airworthiness is. Sometimes there's some other stuff in that equation. And then also, if I'm going to be PIC, I need to be in an environment that I'm supposed to operate in, right? So if the environmental aspects are not good enough for me or I don't feel comfortable, then I probably shouldn't be PIC. So those are the next two questions we're going to talk about. So again, 91.7, there's another part of that regulation that talks about how you have to determine the airworthiness, right? You can't operate a civil aircraft unless it is airworthy. So again, we check for all those things to make sure that the aircraft is airworthy. And we need to make sure that the overall condition is safe. So not just that it's airworthy, right? But it also has to be safe. So sometimes there are things outside of airworthiness that might be unsafe that we have to be aware of, right? So these are the things we've talked about in the past, right? We've talked about Aero, we talked about Aviate, so documents and inspections as well. But 91205 is the premier regulation on the equipment we need to have aboard the airplane. So there's stuff outside of this um, that you might have to have, but for the most part, it's all here in 91205. So for VFR Day, I know some people are taught A Tomato Flames. I was taught Tomato Flames AF, so I will like live and die by Tomato Flames AF. So here are all of the necessary pieces of equipment and instrumentation that you need to have for just visual flight rules during the daytime, right? So a lot of this makes sense. Tachometer, yeah, it's nice to know how fast my engine is running, right? What my RPMs are, and have that tach time on there, right? Oil pressure gauge, that's also nice to have. Magnetic compass, if everything else fails on us, if our heading indicator can't work the way it's supposed to work, then at least we've got a backup. Airspeed, it would be nice to know how fast we're going, right? These are things that we need to have. Everything that has a star here, we don't necessarily have to have. So the temperature gauge, remember our engines are air cooled, so we don't have liquid coolant, so we don't need a temperature gauge. Landing gear position indicator is only applicable if you have retractable landing gear, so we have fixed, so we don't have to worry about that. And manifold pressure gauge kind of gets us into some other systems, so constant speed propeller is what we're talking about there, but we don't have that on our Cessna 172s and 152s. And then flotation devices, right? If you are going out somewhere that puts you greater than gliding distance from shore, you need flotation devices. So a lot of U.S. commercial Part 121 carriers, so your Southwest, your United, Delta, all that, they just have their seat cushions be flotation devices that way. They can use that airplane for all operations, right? They don't have to think about whether it has the flotation devices or not to be flying over a huge lake or the ocean even. They can just send that airplane out because they know it has the stuff. Okay, so those are the things you need during the day. And then at night, it's tomato flames AF, so all that stuff. And then in addition to that, flaps as well. So fuses, we don't have to have that because we have circuit breakers, so we don't have to carry spare fuses. Landing light you do need, especially if you're making money off that thing, but landing lights are always good to have. You can see a little bit better. Anti-collision lights need to be red or white, so things that count for that are going to be like the beacon on the tail. You've got strobes, right? And then the position indicator lights are going to be your nav lights, right? So on the left side, on the left wing, is going to be red, and then the right wing is going to be green. So you must have all those things working just fine, as well as a source of power for night flight during VFR. So with that being said, we know all of these things contribute to airworthiness, but when we have things that are broken, sometimes we have to go outside of our regular practices to see if that thing compromises the airworthiness. If it's a tomato flames AF thing, right, that's so easy to see if it compromises the airworthiness, right? If our oil pressure gauge is like not working properly, boom, I know it's part of 21, or I'm sorry, 91205. So super easy for me to tell that, it's just not okay. The aircraft is unairworthy. But sometimes there are some other lists that can make airworthiness a little bit more complicated. So no matter what kind of operation you're flying, 91205 is going to apply to that, okay, to some extent, even when you do instrument stuff. But some aircraft, some more advanced aircraft, have what we call a minimum equipment list, or an MEL. So this is a list put together by the FAA that lists all of the minimum operative equipment that you need to maintain airworthiness in certain operations. So the MEL is quite comprehensive, right? There's a lot of stuff in that. And it, again, doesn't just say that the stuff needs to be on board the airplane, but it needs to be working. So the way that this benefits, especially like airlines and things, operations like that, is the aircraft spends less time downed for smaller things that shouldn't compromise the airworthiness. So when things don't work on airplanes, like coffee pots, that's a really popular example, or I don't know, a in-flight entertainment device, or just odds and ends like that, right? What the pilots will do is they will look through the minimum equipment list and see, do I need this particular thing to be working for this airplane to be airworthy? And if they don't need that particular thing, then they're good. Okay, so that way the airplane is not spending time down for just like one coffee pot, right? That would be so terrible, so time consuming, and every moment that that airplane is not flying. Why is my cat scratching like that? Hope I hope everything's okay back there. But every moment that that airplane spends not flying and out of service, that airline is losing money. So they need minimum equipment lists to kind of make that process more efficient. So for us, we don't really have that same problem. So we're not going, well, maybe we do, right? We don't really have many airplanes up right now. I think we have three 152s back last time I checked, so we're making progress, right? But for us, we don't have that because we are not we don't have like large advanced airplanes, okay? Something that some of our airplanes do have is a kinds of operations equipment list, or kind of operations equipment list, or KOEL. And this is another FAA approved list that adds things outside of 91205 to the types of operations, right? So it might say that this additional component is required for VFR day or IFR day or whatever type of operation you're running. So some of the stuff might actually be 91205 things that should just, I guess, reinforce 91205, but sometimes it's stuff outside of that. So with the G1000, there are some things in addition to the 91205 stuff that has to be present and operative in order for us to do certain things. So it's probably really pixelated and everything, but you can see that, for instance, the fuel flow indicator has to be present for all of those operations, so pretty much everything you would do. And fuel flow indicator is not something that is specifically named in 91205, right? Fuel quantity indicator, which shows how much fuel you have, is something that's listed, but not a fuel flow indicator. So that's an example of something else. If you go down to the engine indicating section, you can see that the tachometer is needed for all of the operations, and that makes sense, right? That's like the leading item of Tomato Flames AF, right? Tomato Flames AF for life. But that's part of 91205, right? So it just kind of depends. But the KOEL is very helpful. Our G1000s have the KOEL, and it's very easy to just kind of go in there and see, right? If something's not working, then how many of these do I need working for this particular operation? Do I need any? Okay, great, right? So that's pretty easy. So the last type of equipment list that airplanes tend to have, smaller, older airplanes, is a comprehensive equipment list. This is a list of pretty much all of the components that are installed in the airplane that are either required, standard, or optional. So they will have the respective letter next to that part in the comprehensive equipment list, depending on what the status of that part is. So if it's required, it'll have an R, right? Standard, S, O is optional. So if you are, for instance, like missing something, and it's, I don't know, an optional thing, you don't have to be concerned about that, right? Because that's not a required thing for airworthiness, so you don't have to have it. And this particular thing, you can find it in the weight and balance section of your POH, because everything listed in there weighs something, right? Everything has mass, and the locations of those things are listed in there so that when the mechanics go to perform the weight and balance, they're accounting for all of those things. Right, so keep in mind, remember that the weight and balance is something that is specific to that aircraft, right? So even this comprehensive equipment list, even if it's the same model, right, same make and model, the POH is individually itemized by the equipment inside, right? So 546 Alpha might have a part that 549er Alpha does not have, and there's just no way to really know until you really dig into it. Sometimes you can't see that parts are missing, right? Or that parts are there in addition to what you can see. So that's why it's important to make sure that you don't switch the weight and balance, because that would be, I mean, illegal, right? And then you would also have false weight and balance information in your airplane. So if we walk through the process, right, the example I used in class is that the left or the pilot side window just won't open, right, during the pre-flight. So we have to ask ourselves, is the aircraft airworthy? Well, um, is there an inspection for window? No, I don't know of anything for that, so that's not going to fix it. Is there a document for a window that doesn't open? No, so none of the Aero or Aviate stuff applies here. Next thing to consider is the equipment lists, right? So do we have a minimum equipment list for the 172s? No, we don't. So we wouldn't be able to find it in there. The next thing to consider is 91205, right? Is the window part of that? No, I don't think I remember seeing a window. There's not a W in Tomato Flames AF or flaps or any of that. So it's not part of 91205. And then the kinds of operations equipment list. If we are in a Cessna 172 G1000, we can look through that and see, hey, does the window have to be operable, right? Does it have to open? Okay, if we don't have a kinds of equipment list or it's not in there, we would move on to the comprehensive equipment list. So we would go in there and check and see. If we're not finding it in there, then we would just make sure there's no ADs out for that, right? Like that your windows must be able to open, okay? So if this particular thing that's not working isn't in any of those things, the aircraft is airworthy, but we have to do a few things first. We have to either take out the inoperative equipment, which I don't recommend doing, because if you take out something, A, you might not be removing it correctly. B, some things you have to be certificated as a mechanic to remove. And then C, you're changing that weight and balance, right? So you have to have a mechanic come out and recalculate that weight and balance for the aircraft to be airworthy again. Your other option is to deactivate or disconnect whatever that piece of equipment is, um, and then placard it as inoperative. Right. So if your window is not opening, you can't really disconnect that. I wouldn't take that off. I would just leave that. But I would put a sticker on it to placard it to communicate to people that hey, this window does not open. Right. It's inoperative. That way, people don't have questions if there should be some sort of emergency scenario where they have to um, quickly, leave the airplane, right? If they're having trouble popping that window open, that's wasted time. If you've got a fire started by fuel that's like creeping up the wing right towards the fuselage, you need to be trying to get that door open at that point. It should already be open, truthfully, right? That's part of the before the forced landing checklist. Um, but you shouldn't be wasting your time on something because you didn't know that it didn't work, is the point I'm trying to make. Okay, and then after that, make sure that whatever this part is not a safety hazard for the flight. So generally speaking, a window that doesn't open shouldn't be a safety hazard. Um, Maybe you'll get a little warm and uncomfortable in there during the summertime, yeah, but it's not really a safety hazard. Again, as long as it's placarded, right? So people know that that window doesn't open, so they don't waste time trying to do that. So going with that window example, we don't have an MEL as we talked about. The window is not part of 91205. And then a kinds of operation equipment list we don't have in the airplane I use for the example, and it's not an item that's required to be in working condition for any of those operations. So you're not going to find it on the KOEL. Next, we will look at the comprehensive equipment list. And you can see here, here's a page I took from the Cessna 172R model steam gauge POH. This is your part of your comprehensive equipment list in the weight and balance section. And if you go down to where it says windows, there's an S next to window hinged right door openable, right? So on the right side, that's just a standard thing that that window is able to open, and that's not required. But however, if we look at the left door or the pilot's door window, that has to be openable, right? That is a required item for aircraft certification. Therefore, if your left window or pilot side window does not open, that is something that compromises the airworthiness of the airplane. So it seems really silly, but in this situation, again, if you had no services at your airfield, you would have to literally request a ferry permit from the FAA to transport your airplane with a window that won't open to another airport that is able to fix that. So that seems really silly, but it is an airworthiness issue here. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful. And also you can kind of see in this picture the weight, right, of that particular part, and then the location. So arm is something we'll talk about later, but arm is the length behind a certain measuring point called the datum. Sometimes it's arbitrary. In the case of the 172s and the 152s, it's going to be that firewall that divides the cabin from the engine. So they're just measuring backwards from that where those things are. You can actually see some negative values and what that means. So like for instance, under the vacuum system, engine driven dual, right? You can see that says negative 1.8, right? The vacuum pump, the airborne 211cc, that's negative 6.5. And all that means is that it's in front of that firewall. So everything aft of the firewall, so back in the cabin and all the way back to the tail, is going to be a positive value. And then things in front of the firewall are going to be a negative value. So if that confuses you, I promise we'll sort it all out when we talk about weight and balance, which is kind of a cool thing to note. All right, let's talk about VFR weather minimums. So we went over these in class, but I want to help you guys study these and get these in your minds because these are important to know. Class Alpha has no weathermins because you can't be VFR up there. You have to be IFR. Remember, VMC and VFR are not the same thing. So visual flight rules is a set of rules, whereas VMC just means visual meteorological conditions. So it can be VMC in Class Alpha, but we still have to operate IFR or follow instrument flight rules to be up there. So there are no weathermins for that. The nice thing about Class Bravo, Charlie, and Delta is they're fairly similar, right? So Bravo is kind of special. It requires 3 statute miles of visibility for VFR ops, but as long as you maintain your clearance from the clouds, you are fine to operate in the Class Bravo under VFR. And clear of clouds, all that means is my cat is scratching my chair. No, you gotta stay down there right now, dude. I'm recording a lecture. Hey, stop it. Okay, so you have to have the 3 statute miles of visibility, and clear of clouds, all that means is just don't go in the clouds. You can have clouds literally right off your wing as long as you do not go in them. Okay, so that's the only rule. And the reasoning for this is the Bravo is a lot busier, right? It's a smaller area of airspace with a large concentration of traffic. So if they have people trying to maintain the, I don't know, 2,000 feet horizontally from the clouds and things like that, they're going to have problems with air traffic separation, right? So clear of clouds is the rule for the Bravo. The Charlie and the Delta are the same, right? So that's the nice thing about them is that it's still 3 statute miles of visibility and 1,000 feet above the clouds, 500 below, 2,000 feet horizontally or laterally. And the easiest way to remember this is 152, right? If you fly the 152, you're already a step ahead. If you fly the 172, still, it's 152, right? So 3 152 is how I remember both the Charlie and the Delta. Echo gets a little bit different, right? It kind of splits up a little bit, but Echo is nothing compared to Golf, right? So the Charlie just is, the Delta just is, the Bravo just is, right? Class Echo below 10,000 is also 3 152. So for all of your training, you're probably not going to go above 10,000. So for the most part, when you are in the Echo, the limits of the VFR weather minimums are going to be 3 152. When you do go above 10,000 feet in Class Echo, then it expands to 5 statute miles. And the reasoning for this is the change in speed limit. So when you're below 10,000 MSL, the speed limit is 250 knots. Okay, so can't go any faster than that. But once you cross that threshold, once you climb above 10,000 feet, you are now free to do any speed you like all the way up to Mach 1. Right, so that's the new speed limit. So that's quite the change, right? And I believe below 10,000 feet, ATC has to approve you going above 250 knots if you want to do that. So sometimes when military pilots want to do like a crazy climb out at a super high airspeed or whatever, or it's like an air show or whatever, ATC basically allows them to perform an unrestricted climb or whatever. And what that means is they can go as high as they want. They can go any airspeed that they want to. So yes, more visibility the higher you are, and then the cloud clearances also change. You need 1,000 feet above and below the clouds, but also 1 statute mile horizontally. So not 1,000 feet, but 1 statute mile horizontally. Okay, so 5 111 above 10,000. Now, if we move on to class golf, we can break it up in a couple different ways. So let's go ahead and talk about class golf above and below 10,000 MSL, just like we did Echo. So again, anytime you're above 10,000 MSL, right, and also above 1,200 AGL, right, it is again still 5 statute miles of visibility, 1,000 feet above, 1,000 feet below, and 1 statute mile horizontally. So 5111 for that. The nice thing is that for that particular line of class golf, you don't really have to think so much about the above 1,200 AGL. Well, actually, no, you do have to think about that. But yes, if you're above 10,000 MSL and above 1,200 AGL, it's 5111. Now, anytime you are below 10,000 MSL, the only thing that matters is if you are under 1,200 AGL or above 1,200 AGL. If you are under 1,200 AGL, there's a daytime set of minimums and then a nighttime set. So the nighttime set is always 3152. Okay, in class golf, unless you're above that 10,000, right? If it's a day and night sort of set of mins, it's always 3152. So 3152 at night if you're below 1,200 AGL, and then during the day, because you are really close to the ground, right, you're not going to need a lot of visibility. The lower you are to the ground, generally speaking, the less risk there is really of endangering like other property and stuff like that, other air traffic or anything. So you're kind of by yourself. So you only need 1 statute mile of visibility, and then clear clouds, just like the Bravo, right? So just don't go in the clouds. You could be next to them, just don't go in them. So 1 in clear clouds during the day, and then 3152 at night if you are less than 1,200 AGL. If you are above 1,200 AGL but less than 10,000 MSL, again, it breaks apart into a day and a nighttime set of mins. So nighttime is always what? Yeah, I can't hear you guys, but 3152, right? I'm sure you guys got it right. 3152 for night. And then during the day, if you're above 1,200 AGL but less than 10,000 MSL, then the visibility is the same. So 1 statute mile, just like if you were below 1,200 AGL. But the cloud clearances change a little bit. So you need to be 1,000 feet above, right? 500 below, 2,000 feet laterally, just like the Charlie and Delta and the Echo below 10,000. Okay. So it's 152 during the day and 152 at night if you are above 1,200 AGL but less than 10,000 MSL. So that is the breakdown. There's, I think, this triangle graphic that's out there. If you guys want to find that and use that to learn, that's totally fine. I am more a fan of just kind of remembering the stuff. So just walk through it enough times, right? Group all of these airspaces that are similar or the same in terms of minimums together, right? So Bravo, Charlie, Delta is really easy to walk through. So Bravo is like 3 in clear of clouds, right? And then the Charlie and the Delta are the same, 3152. If we move on to Echo, we know that Echo below 10,000 is 3152. And then Echo above 10,000 is 5111. Okay, so golf is where it gets hard. So let's just start from the bottom, right? If we are below 1,200 AGL, we know there's a day and night time, right? Set of mins. So day is going to be 1 and clear of clouds because we're really low, right? And then nighttime is always 152. If we are above 1,200 AGL but less than 10,000 MSL, so we're like kind of building ourselves up, right? Again, there's a day and nighttime dichotomy. So during the day, 1 statute mile of visibility, and then 152, right, for the cloud clearancer. So 152, and then at night, again, as always, it's 152 at nighttime in golf. Okay, unless you're above 10,000, right, which is our next one. So if we're above 10,000 MSL and then also above 1,200 AGL, then 5111, just like that Echo above 10,000. So the easiest way to break this up is to pair the Charlie, the Delta, and the Echo below 10,000 together, right? And then all the night times in the Golf to make 3152. And then the next pairing I would probably make is between the Echo above 10,000 and Golf above 10,000 and also above 1,200 AGL, right? Those are both 5111. All that leaves us is the Bravo, right, which is just 3 in clear clouds. That's pretty easy. It's just a little different. And then the golf daytime, right? So remember, the lower you are, the less stringent they are about the amount of visibility and cloud clearance you need, right? So if you're below that 1200 AGL, one in clear of clouds. If you're above the 1200 AGL but below 10,000 MSL, one 152. Okay, so that's how I would think about that. Think about it logically. The closer you are to the ground, probably the less visibility and things you're going to need. But that's how I would do it, is just group them and just go through them. Make yourself flashcards, verbalize it like I'm doing now. I'm literally sitting here, I promise you, my eyes are closed, and I'm just seeing that chart in my mind, right? I'm just recreating it and putting in the information in those respective groups. So part of being a master at this and pretty much everything in this class and being set up for that written test is just knowing how to study. If you can figure yourself out what works for you, what doesn't work for you, and what gets you those results that you want to see, then you are set. Okay, so learn how to study if you haven't already. Learn what you need, and I'm here to help you with what you need. If you figure out what you need and it's not here, you want more practice, you want I don't know, quiz, you want office hours, whatever. I'm here to help. Okay, I only have a limited amount of time because I'm a human just like you guys, but I will try my best to help you out. Okay. So with that, that is all I pretty much have for VFR Weathermans. Um, I had this example in class where I talked about the delta and how that's requiring at least 3 statute miles of visibility. And I showed you this picture of New York, right, where there's only 6 statute miles of visibility. Um, and 6 doesn't look all that great, but all of that is to just reinforce the fact that legal doesn't always mean safe, right? So at this point, 3 is the bare minimum you could be PIC in as a student pilot. So it's legal during the daytime anyway, but it's probably something that you shouldn't be in right at this point. So just because it's legal doesn't always mean it's safe. We have to create these personal minimums to make ourselves feel safe. So what might happen at the beginning is you might choose, I don't know, 10 statute miles of visibility as your personal mins, right? So I'm not going out and flying as PIC unless the weather is at least 10 statute miles of visibility. As you acquire more experience and more certificates and ratings and things, that number is likely going to drop down, right? So I've been in visibility as low as, I want to say maybe 2 statute miles of visibility, maybe less than that. But there's of course a time during my training where I didn't want to go in anything less than like 7 or 8, right? And if you guys go out on a day where it is like 7 or 8 statute miles of visibility, it's kind of eye-opening, right? Because we get used to that METAR saying 10 statute miles of visibility, but that's not really what we see out there, right? We're seeing much more than that 10 miles. It's just that's as high as the equipment can measure, right? So just forming those things for yourself and then evolving them, right, with your training is part of being a pilot. So what I'm saying is follow the regulations for sure, right? But sometimes you might need a little extra cushion on top of that to make sure that you feel comfortable and safe. So that's what it's all about. Is it good to go outside of your boundaries sometimes? Yes. Do you need to be safe about that? Yes. For instance, if you are trying to change your mins regarding, I don't know, crosswind component, you wouldn't go out and practice your crosswinds by yourself as a student pilot, right? Even if you had a valid solo endorsement, you would likely go with your instructor to get that training, right? To help yourself get more comfortable with that. So again, it's a great thing to test those limits. Just make sure you're doing it in a safe manner. Okay. Okay, so that's all I have for you guys. If you have questions, don't hesitate to send me an email or shoot me a text or come to office hours or whatever. I am here for you guys to help make this as easy as I can. I know it's not. You guys are probably laughing. He said easy. I know it's not easy, and it's a lot of information, but I will try to make this as bearable as possible. Okay. All right. Thanks, guys.